Loading wetlands and improving water quality. I'm going to do a little introduction of everybody real quick. We are joined by three amazing speakers today, including Zach Weiss. We're going to talk about improving water quality in floating wetlands. So first off, we're going to have Nick Wesley. He's the director and co-founder of Urban Rivers. And then we have Max Rome. He's the director of green infrastructure at the city of Boston. And then we have Alexandra Ionescu, who's the director of regenerative projects for Bio for Climate. Of course, we have Zach Weiss, the founder of Water Stories. And we're going to have Zach take it away. But this is a really, really cool topic because as much as we talk about increasing water capture and water retention, improving water quality and reducing water pollution is vital. It's the next vital piece that all of us face. And I know we've all touched that. So a lot of us in the summer, we can't swim in lakes because of algae blooms, or we can't swim in the rivers we love in the city because there's too much water pollution. And floating wetlands are a key piece of the puzzle for improving water quality in the rivers and the water we love. So Zach, why don't we take it away and we'll get started.
Awesome. Thank you everyone for joining us here today. And thank you, Nick, Max, and Alexandra for sharing about this very important topic. We see water quality issues becoming worse year after year all around the world. And at the same time, there's some really wonderful examples of positive changes that people have made for water quality. I think when we look at our interactions with water, especially as larger civilization areas, cities, large towns are concerned, water is this ultimate giver of life, and we turn her into our garbage man, where, we fill it with all sorts of things that shouldn't be in the water. In North America, where these projects are based, you used to be able to drink out of any body of water on the continent when Columbus first arrived. And now there's entire states where no water meets the standards for fishable or swimmable. So we've gone from drinkable everywhere to you shouldn't even touch it with your skin type territory, and you shouldn't eat the fish out of it. And there's a lot of ways to solve these issues. And in the urban context, space is at a premium. And so the actual floating area above the water makes a tremendous amount of sense. So we're really excited to have our amazing guests share this with you guys today. And first up, Nick Wesley, we'll let you take it away.
Awesome. Well, thanks for having me. Excited to be here. My name is Nick Wesley. I'm the executive director at Urban Rivers. We're a nonprofit based out of Chicago with the mission of transforming urban waterways into wildlife sanctuaries. And so, I'll give you kind of an image of Chicago. This is how it looked in 1820. And one thing you'll notice is, you have rivers that really, they meander through. They're not very straight. You can see kind of these large kind of swoops in it. There's sandbars. It's something that looks like it would change over time, as the waters move and carve out new paths and things like that. It's a very dynamic system. And so this is kind of the natural state of most rivers. This is the kind of thing that, especially in our area, all of the plants and wildlife really evolved around. And so as the city gained population and, became more of an urban center, we transformed our waterways to fit the kind of needs of the time. And so a lot of that was shipping and sewage, essentially. And so what we did is we would widen the river. We would line it with steel, wood, or concrete edges. We would dredge it, so we would make it deep enough so that large boats can get through. And all of this is because the water traffic was, really heavy. That was, other than rail, the main way that goods moved in and out of the city. And in Chicago's case, we actually reversed our river to make it a connection to the Mississippi and then down to the Gulf of Mexico, so you can get from the Great Lakes. So all of this effort went into transforming it for this kind of one particular use. And you could see, we really did use it back in the day. And this is not a, this photo I think is from like 1952 or something. And I don't think they did that very often, but they did it once. Yeah. Enormous. But this problem isn't just a Chicago problem. This is a very normal thing you'd see all in rivers all around the world. So this is a picture of Buffalo in 1910. You could see it's packed with boats, moving in and out. And this is what that same area looks like today. This is Cleveland, very similar picture. But this is what it looks like today. So, all of this effort, in this effort, it was everything. Every little piece that could be optimized, we tried to optimize. And so this is a shot in Chicago. You could see they're in the process of straightening the channel line. So you can see just that tiny little bend, the amount of effort that went into getting rid of that. So it was a tremendous feat for everybody. But then what happened? After a period of time, we started to use highways. So cities, they all copied the same river tactics, the same river techniques. And then, in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, they started to build all these highways, starting in New York and a lot of the things that Robert Moses was doing. Those kind of techniques were then copied and applied to cities all around the world. And what that did is it kind of decoupled the industrial base of a city from its waterway. It made that feature not as essential as it previously was. And so, what that left us with is a ton of highways and then a ton of rivers who are all built for this kind of single purpose that are then left kind of derelict and empty. And so, we're kind of at the point where now we got to think of what's next. How do we kind of reinvigorate these rivers, transform them more for the uses of today and the problems of today, So that's kind of the basis of where we're thinking. So, one of the main issues with these waterways, even as water quality improves in different ways, there is no habitat. We've taken all of that natural flow, all of the processes that you'd find in them, we've taken it out and we've engineered it for a purpose that is pretty foreign to all the wildlife and the ecosystem that used to kind of proliferate in these areas. So this is one of our co-founders, Jeff Yellen. He's, let's say, walking the dog. This is a test unit that we put in that's about, it was about, 5 foot by 10 foot wrapped, a very, very small kind of floating garden. So you put this in to test and see how these artificial floating wetlands affected fish habitat. So this photo was taken in 2013. And what we were able to find is there was a statistically significant amount of fish underneath the wetland versus in open water or underneath the dock, which were the two controls. So it kind of left us with this little nugget of information that, these things can have an effect, that it really requires a much larger effort to really make a measurable impact. And so, in 2016, we did a Kickstarter. And then in 2017, this is the first garden we installed. So this photo was taken pretty quickly after we installed, within, a couple weeks. And you could see all the plants are there, kind of in rows neatly. And then a couple months later, this is what it looked like. So, what this shows us is that there's a ton of nutrients, excess nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, all the stuff that's in the waterway that these plants are then pulling up and using as their own fertilizer. So they're taking advantage of some of the issues that we have in our waterways. And so, this was really great. We were trying to think of, okay, what's next? How can we continue to expand that? And that's really where the Wild Mile came out of. So the Wild Mile itself is a vision for a mile-long floating eco park within the east side of Moose Island. So transforming this whole area into one of the most natural places in the Chicago River. So we partnered with the city, did a lot of public meetings about it, talked with a bunch of different stakeholders, tried to get ideas and thoughts about what, people really wanted to see. You can see that's a much younger version of myself in the background. Great. And this is kind of the result of what we came up with. And so this is the design for the first section, which we call the learning platform. And And then we actually did it, and so this went in 2021. It really opened at late 21, opened in 22. And so this is the first section of the Wild Mile in the river. So, it's showing that it's possible, and there's a way to create both public space for people to be immersed in nature within an urban environment, while also maintaining a wildlife first approach and creating habitat and the healthy ecosystem within the urban environment. So, what is the learning platform, and why do we choose this as kind of our first attempt at it? So in that process of the public meetings and everything like that, we started to, one of our partners is this guy, Reverend Randall Blakey at the Near Earth Unity Program. And his insight was make this a classroom, a floating classroom, make the first section something where you can bring down full class of people out and learn about the river, learn about the ecosystem. And we really took that as kind of marching orders to make something that would not only revitalize the ecosystem, but also help the people around it learn more about it and be more connected to it and see this as a path forwards and how people can interact with their waterways. So, so these are a couple shots of people learning about stuff. I think this is a macroinvertebrate study, but so as we do this, we look at a couple pillars in how we kind of operate. So it's not only just an ecosystem, but it's also kind of a real community asset. And so we have things like education, which I touched on, community science. So a lot of our research is, we have a lot of researchers who have their data collected by volunteers. So we have teams of volunteers that go out and they do mussel surveys or finding pregnant mussels in the winter. They count the macroinvertebrates. They do water quality sample, all sorts of stuff. So having the community be part of this whole research phase is really important. Obviously, there's recreation and then volunteerism. So having people be part of the whole solution. We all started as volunteers, and the only way our organization really operates is with a really large cohort of people willing to put their time and effort into helping make this thing possible. So, in addition to all that, we program the space. So we have about 250 events a year, ranging from things like yoga to speaker series to art nights and things like that. So all sorts of different ways that people are able to kind of use this floating park and take advantage of all of this. So, here's just another shot of people paddling. We do a lot of trash cleanup. So this is one of our rangers who's going out there picking up trash and also observing a fantastic turtle we call Chonkosaurus. I think this is Chonkosaurus. There's two. They're pretty big. It's hard to tell the difference, but, big turtles. Great stuff. And then this is, people planting some of these islands. So all of our modules are built and planted by volunteers, which I'll kind of get into in a little bit. And then the fruits of the labor are the wildlife. So, in an urban context, it's pretty, most people don't realize that you can see things like beavers and muskrats, tons of different birds and butterflies and things like that, all within, a pretty dense area of the city. And so by creating these spaces, we're offering an area where this wildlife can really thrive. And then, ideally people who can become more connected to it can see some of these things in action, which is kind of a fun knock-on effect. And for all of our bird nerds, we have a ton of birds that we see coming through here. So I think we've had 111 species spotted at the Wild Mile, which is nuts. Please don't ask me to name them all because I will fail. But yeah, so, and a lot of things are migratory. So there are things that they show up for a couple weeks and then they're gone. And so we're seeing more and more abundance of that and showing this kind of importance in creating these natural spaces in an urban context to create habitat for some of these creatures as they move through. In addition, we have native mussels, which we basically find pregnant mussels in more natural areas of the river, so up in forest preserves, things like that. We bring them to a lab, they rear them, and then we transplant the mama mussel back to wherever we found her, and then the babies into these kind of bunkers, mussel bunkers that we're creating on the islands. And these things, they filter about 10 gallons of water per day per mussel, which then, they're sucking out all of that stuff that's floating, all the suspended solids and stuff in the river, which then creates a clearer waterway, which then means you get better light penetration, which then means you get more aquatic plants below and things like that, which helps remediate the soil. And, these things are just workhorses of the river. In similar waterways, they can make up to 90+% of the biomass in a river system. So they're really important, and they've been in a lot of areas, because of how we dredged and dammed our rivers, they've been physically removed. And so creating these spaces really, really helps. The gardens themselves, they have all native plants that you would find at a river edge in the riparian corridor. The plants then grow through the floating gardens, and then the roots hang below. That creates space for microbes and other things to grow on the roots. It creates structure for fish to use, and it really adds another layer to the whole ecosystem. There's a couple other shots of the roots in action, so you can see they're pretty big. And you'll see things like small juvenile fish hiding in them from predators. You'll see fish breeding in them, eating the roots, all sorts of stuff. So it works out really well. We also monitor macroinvertebrates. So these are kind of one of the lowest levels of the food chain. And so we kind of measure the diversity of different species and quantity, and we've been able to see an increase around the flowing wetlands versus the control. So just a normal seawall and things like that. So that shows that this is kind of working from within the full food chain. So Bubbly Creek. So after the Wild Mile, we continue to expand into a couple other areas. This area, if you ever read Upton Sinclair's The Jungle or heard of it, there's a section about Bubbly Creek. It was extremely polluted. They used to dump all of the cows and carcasses and everything like that from the stockyards. And this now is really transforming and becoming kind of a really interesting public space. So you'll see a lot more fish diversity in this area. The water quality is getting better, and the floating gardens are kind of helping contribute to a lot of that stuff. We also have a community kayak program we launched. So every Friday from like 3 to sundown, people can come in a kayak for free, paddle around, see the river, see the gardens, and really get to experience that ecosystem in real life. So River Park, it's another location. I'm running short on time, so I'm going to skip it. But it's a great spot. But this is so after doing the first section of the Wild Mile, we continue to expand it. And so this is some shots of the process of putting it all together. So hundreds of volunteers come out. We we install these floating docks in first, and then we add in all of these, the floating wetland modules. And so people first start by bolting all of these things together, arranging them correctly. Then they layer on a bunch of mulch and leca, so clay aggregate, which is essentially gravel. And then after they lay all of this stuff down, then we go into planting. So we fill this up with all sorts of different native plants. You can see how excited they are to plant. It wasn't tedious at all, nor hard. It was very fun, every single moment. So, yeah. And so this is it. Right after it was all planted, so you can see everything's real tiny, young plants. We also put in some trees in this area. I think this one's a pawpaw, which is a kind of fruits like a mango. It's a native Illinois tree. It's pretty cool. There's Steven, our head of field operations. And so, yeah, a couple aspects which are really cool on this one, this kind of new section. We added in my favorite is this river reed section in the middle. So that is submerged modules. They're about 2 feet below the water surface. We loaded it up with sand and gravel, and that's where we put some mussel bunkers, as well as adding lilies and other things like that, where we're able to see, the first year this was in, we saw, I think it was like 11 pumpkin seeds. So it's like a type of sunfish making little dens in that area. There's a couple other submerged areas where we saw bass spawning. And so it shows that the fish are really using this, and it's helping to increase their habitat area and their population, which is it's fantastic to see. And so this is a photo of it fully grown in. You can see, can't really tell the rows and everything like that. I think it looks great. But this technique is something that can be applicable not just here, not just in Chicago waterways, but all around the world. And so when you look at cities like this is in New York, this is in Tokyo, we're having very similar issues everywhere else. And so ideally this kind of technique can be adapted, improved, and implemented in areas, all sorts of areas that are facing similar challenges. So, yeah, thank you guys.
Awesome. Thank you, Nick. That was so excellent. We oftentimes cite Chicago as this example of just really pronounced water craziness in terms of making the river flow the other direction to get the sewage away from their drinking water. And so it's really awesome to see these kind of efforts also taking hold there. That feels like a big pivotal moment. So really thankful for all your work there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Next up, we have Max Rome, who is the City of Boston's Director of Green Infrastructure, to share about work that they're doing on the East Coast of the country.
What a delight to go after Nick. You said all the hard things, so I can just kind of talk about this fun project. So I'm sharing our Charles River floating wetland. Here's Boston in the background. This is the Salt and Pepper Bridge, and this is our little wetland that got installed in 2020, and we did a lot of research on it. So I think what I'm going to kind of focus on is, a little bit of the, how do these things work and how do we measure it? But I think that the place to start is, with the history of Boston and the river a little bit. So, Boston, was a tiny little peninsula when, the Pilgrims settled here in the 1600s, and the Charles River was a tidal estuary. It was like all, mud flats and salt marsh. And over time, the city built into the river. The kind of whole story about that is so interesting, but, kind of the cliff notes is, the city dumped, the city was built before the flush toilet was invented. And the Charles River was the flushing toilet that took, sewage out into the harbor and then out into the ocean. And that wasn't a very good system. At some point, there was so much poop that was building up on the tidal flats that people didn't really know about germs yet, but they knew that it smelled very, very terrible. And they were trying to come up with a plan for how to deal with this. They said, well, we could build sewers to a wastewater treatment plant. And they're like, that's pretty expensive. They're like, well, you know what? What if we just keep those tidal flats underwater all the time so we don't have to smell the poop? And that's basically what ended up happening. So that's how the Charles River got dammed. And today the river is kind of like this very special, wide, slow-moving, kind of warm urban reservoir. I think the big picture story for the Charles is that we've been reducing pollution and we've been seeing the river get healthier. In terms of kind of bacterial contamination, the river's in better shape than it's ever been. But we still have a really big problem, which are these seasonal algal blooms, and the word for this is eutrophication. So, the river is overfed. The river is getting more nutrients, more organic material than it can process biologically. And the real source of this in our watershed, 300 square miles drain into the Charles River. A lot of it is pretty paved. A lot of it is cities and suburbs. And all of that material carries nutrients and freshwater. Phosphorus is the main thing that limits the growth of algae. And there's all those wetlands are gone. There's not a way to process these nutrients, and we get serious algal blooms many, many summers. And my interest in this is kind of like, how else can we tackle this? We've, as a region, as a city, my work is very focused on pollution control. What can we do to keep that stormwater out of the river, get it into the ground, get it filtered through green infrastructure before it enters the river? But, as we kind of get closer and closer to our goals, what else can we do? What direct interventions can we be making to kind of create, pockets within this urban river that function the way we'd like to see them, that are healthy, that support some of the creatures and plants that should be here. And that's what this project is all about. So here's a little fun, beautiful video of this wetland. My graduate research was spent paddling out and doing sampling at this wetland. And I think, for folks who know about floating wetlands or have spent time around them, they're just really, peaceful, concentrated places where there's so much life in one spot. It's a very kind of transporting and relaxing experience to spend time around them. But how do floating wetlands provide treatment? What do they actually do? This is a diagram that we put together to kind of try and explain some of the mechanisms. One thing that they do is they remove nutrients. These plants are growing hydroponically. So where are they going to get the phosphorus that they need to grow? They're going to take it right out of the water column. That's important. Another thing that they do is, we call it enhanced sedimentation, but some of the junk that's in water, some of the pollution that comes from stormwater, is fine particulate matter. And one way to remove that material, to get it out of the water column, is just to let it settle, to let it drift to the bottom of the river. And the root columns that Nick showed those beautiful pictures of, they really slow the water down. And when water moves slowly, that sediment can start to drop off. Also in those big kind of balloony colloidal masses associated with the roots, there's all these snails, there's all these detrivores that kind of start to eat that stuff up. And there's actually a tremendous amount of just snail poop that you'll find underneath the floating wetlands. And it's a little, rain of some of this organic material finding its way out of the water column, and hopefully into the sediment. And then the final question that we were really trying to study and measure is, biotic structure. How does the presence of a floating wetland, how does the presence of this habitat change the food chain, and especially the part of the food chain that in a healthy water body can control the growth of harmful algal blooms? And the kind of critical link there is zooplankton, these microcrustaceans, and especially the largest microcrustaceans, the Daphnia and copepods are the kind of all-stars of eating algae as it grows. We set up a kind of study approach that was a control location, an experimental location. These are some pictures of the installation. We went out and we did kind of daily to weekly monitoring for intensively for 3 summers. We did this during COVID, and one real highlight of the project was actually setting up a backyard laboratory because our research center at Northeastern was closed down during the summer of 2020. And a major partner for this project was the Charles River Conservancy. And, there's so much kind of beyond the research in terms of public outreach and communication. They designed this amazing curriculum for 5th graders in the city of Cambridge and distributed these, cool little floating wetland kits to try and explain the basic concept to elementary school kids. But this is a lot of what my research looked like, netting and then counting these, crazy creatures that are floating around in the river that have a very important job to do. And we actually, we collaborated with the Wild Mile. We got some of their data. We also worked with another floating wetland in Baltimore at the National Aquarium. And we were able to really try and understand, it's very hard to measure the effect of a floating wetland when it's small, when it's in a well-mixed water body. But we had a lot of data, and we were able to see that there were some, statistically significant changes in especially the abundance of large-bodied zooplankton in the proximity of the wetland. So, we have evidence from the field that these, floating wetland habitats are creating an ecology, a biotic structure that looks more like a healthy water body and less like a kind of degraded, algae-dominated urban river. We also looked at quantifying phosphorus removal through uptake from the floating wetlands, and what is really obvious to people who try and put plants in urban rivers is that plants love to grow in these nutrient-rich urban rivers. And as they do, they're soaking up a lot of nutrients. What they do is kind of comparable to other green infrastructure strategies. So, on kind of a dollars per pound basis or a cost per square foot, these systems function in a way that's similar to, building a rain garden, building a green roof. So it, from that perspective, there's a good argument to be made for them. Then I'll talk a little bit about what's next. So this is the Cambridge side of the river, and this is Broad Canal, about as urban of a water body as you can imagine. And we are in the process. The Charles River Conservancy is leading a process right now to really kind of take this project to scale, and create, an eco park, to kind of transform this canal into something that is not just, a little bubble of different ecology floating out in the river, but, something that can really change the dynamics and the ecological health of this whole section of the Charles River, and a section of the river that's very important because it's, not only do hundreds of thousands of people come through here, but it also kind of happens to be the place where our cyanobacterial blooms are most intense during the summertime. So thanks a lot. Happy to answer some questions or share more information afterwards.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Max. That's really inspiring stuff that you guys are doing. And I love how there's this theme of education and outreach throughout all of these projects. I think that makes the impact so much greater over time to get all these young people involved. So really a highlight seeing that. Next up, we have Alexandra Onesco, who is actually was a student of our course last year. Really awesome blossoming practitioner on the East Coast, and representing the Below and Above Ground Collective as well today.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with the Water Stories community alongside two projects our collective deeply admires. Thank you, Nick and Max, for providing such an incredible context and history and in-depth why, and for your meaningful work. I also, like Zach mentioned, I had the honor to taking the core class last year and profoundly shaped how I understand the water cycle. And I'm presenting today on behalf of the Below and Above Collective in Providence, Rhode Island. Hope Leeson, Holly Ewald, August Lerica, Matthew Mueller, and Max Furtick. They will during the Q&A. We weave together diverse knowledge systems, plant knowledge, construction, education, research, and ecological design to construct floating wetlands out of natural materials. As an origin point, our group formed almost by chance. Holly and I met after she gave a lecture about a polluted pond she had been working on. I asked whether she had considered floating wetlands. She did, and we decided to explore whether we could build one. Holly knew Hope, I knew Matt and Augie, Max was researching Japanese knotweed. The collective came together organically around the shared curiosity. Around the same time, we came across an opportunity called Art on the Trails, an outdoor site-specific installation program that had just launched a call for proposal for artists. A map was provided, and when we looked at it, we saw a pond, and it felt like the right place to propose something not static, but something that could actively participate in the life of the pond and the web of life surrounded it. We applied and were accepted, and perhaps more importantly, no permit was required, which allowed us to move quickly from idea to action. I know in the case of Max and Nick, there were these more complex permitting pathways processes that they also innovated with. And so as a collective, we began asking, can we combine art with ecological functionality? What is the role of the artist in cultivating awareness of water quality and stormwater runoff? And how might we experiment with natural buoyancy and abundant local plant materials? But the opportunity only gave us a site. What guided us was something deeper that Max and Nick also touched upon. The idea that in our cities, impervious surfaces send stormwater rushing directly into ponds and lakes, carrying nutrients and pollutants with it. Many of these water bodies have lost their filtering capacity that wetlands and native plants once provided. If a water body is to regenerate, we must restore that ecological function and recreate the conditions for life to return. And as Bruce Kanya says, you don't clean up water in hopes of resurrecting the food web. You resurrect the food web in order to clean up water. And together we became deeply curious about the life and natural processes that actually make that possible. The microorganisms, the plant roots, the biofilms, the nutrient cycling that transform water from within. And we worked with a local artist, Jasmine Godbrod, to create this illustration. That is a sign. I'll show it later in the presentation. Before building with research, we examined existing floating wetlands, ecological diagrams, and the invisible life in freshwater systems. We were inspired by John Todd's son work with building a floating wetland with the community out of natural materials. We were also very drawn to understanding how floating islands form in nature. How plant roots accumulating organic matter and ecological processes allow them to hold together and remain buoyant over time. The book on the left contains meaningful information on their formation and natural mechanisms that sustain their buoyancy. Just a heads up, it has about 1,800 references. So it's a lot of maze-like research. But we were also inspired by indigenous floating island communities who have lived in close relationship with water and on water for generations. Particularly the Uros people of Lake Titicaca in Peru, who build floating islands from totora reeds using a single plant for structure, buoyancy, shelter, and even food. You can see here a little diagram in the book Low Tech about the buoyancy of a brick module. It's really fascinating how floating islands are buoyant in nature just by the release of certain gases. After researching and discussing, each of us sketched our own prototype, exploring form, materials, configurations, and how to achieve natural buoyancy. That origin point led to the creation of our 2 floating wetland structures. Today, I'll briefly share the construction, assembly process, planting, community involvement, and education, some lessons learned, and the more than human life now using the structures. We built primarily with dried stalks of Japanese knotweed, an abundant, non-native, rhizomatic plant with a hollow bamboo-like stem. It spreads mainly through underground rhizomes, and we harvest it in late fall, ideally, or early spring before new growth begins. When dried in shaded cover conditions, the stalks become more dimensionally stable. Their hollow core provides initial buoyancy before gradually becoming waterlogged, while the lightweight stem remains structurally resilient in water. We experimented with Phragmites as well, but its abundant, wind-dispersed seeds, small and easy to miss, easy to spread, made it very challenging to manage it responsibly. And since it's a water-loving plant, unlike the Japanese knotweed, it provided additional risks. But for the two structures we built, volunteers always help harvest the Japanese knotweed from various patches across the city, repurposing it into a construction material. Each planting bed is a simple triangle made from 3 bamboo poles with a stainless steel mesh stretched across the middle. The triangle is sized to fit neatly into the space created when 3 floating pontoons are tied together. We place dry Japanese knotweed stalks on top of the mesh to add extra buoyancy and give roots something to grow through as the plants get more established. And once the frame is ready, we hand-stitched a coconut coir sleeve around it. Small openings are cut into the coir so bare roots plants can be inserted. And the roots are tucked between the knotweed stalks. Together, the coir and the knotweed create a supportive pocket. We don't use any soil. No soil is needed, giving plants time to establish before their roots grow down into the water column. The way we build this structure is collaborative. We invite friends and community members to help us assemble the pontoons, so the building process becomes part of the project itself. For the first structure, we use simple kiddie pools as incubators. The plant bed set in pond water for about a month before launch, so the roots could start adjusting to aquatic conditions. I will say that and I'll share this more in lessons learned, but if you are planting in urban settings, we've learned that it's best to start the process ahead of time. And then we transported the modules to the site and assembled them along the shoreline before launching. For the second structure, the pond was shallow enough that we could assemble the pontoons and planting beds directly in the water. And this time we had waders. That made a big difference. When the pond allows it, building in the water and going in the water in waders makes it a little bit more easier. And as you might have seen, we use the tetrahedron, and we chose this structure because it's one of the most stable geometric forms, creates strength with very little material. It lifts the structure vertically, adding habitat for birds and additional surface area for dragonfly, damselflies, and butterflies. It also signals that this is both an ecological infrastructure and sculpture, and becomes a way to track time and plant growth as the structure changes through the season. And we selected a diverse palette of native wetland species, grasses, sedges, rushes, wildflowers, shrubs, and vines to recreate some of that structural and functional diversity of wetland plants above and below the waterline. Different root depths, growth patterns, and bloom times allow the system to function as a layered community rather than a single planting. And the roots provide habitats for diverse life, surface area, nutrient uptake, and microbial activity, as Max and Nick also described. The species highlighted in green were planted in both structures. For the second structure, we also experimented with native vines, though we're still learning how to establish them. In the next slides, you'll see their growth and blooming unfold over time and completing their life cycle. I'm not able to go into a lot of detail due to time, but I hope the photographs speak for themselves and tell a story. This is our first structure. This is the first day we launched the structure on the water. A few weeks later, and then evolving over time. Here you can start seeing the cardinal flower, the pickerel weed, the swamp milkweed, the blue vervain, and then here you can see them all in bloom. And it's very important to complete the full life cycle. So here it is. I think this was in December, if I remember correctly, and Hope collected seeds as well. After installing our first structure at Ice Pond, we began conversation with the Stormwater Innovation Center in Providence about adding a floating wetland to their large portfolio of green infrastructure examples and experimentations. Through those discussions and their ongoing data collections, we learned that Polo Lake was experiencing elevated phosphorus inputs and recurring cyanobacteria blooms. In collaboration with the Stormwater Innovation Center and the Providence Parks Department, we applied for a wetland permit. It took some time to get it, but everyone was incredibly supportive, and we got it and we were able to launch the structure. And the support of the Stormwater Innovation Center and the Providence Park Department meant more than we can fully express, and we're very grateful that they allowed us to install our structure in the park. And unlike the first structure, we actually invited the community to plant with us. So here are diverse members of the community planting the structure. We had the honor to have Lauren Spears from the Narragansett tribe. She planted a silky dogwood that is still thriving on the water. Then the community helped us move the pontoons and help us prepare the staging process. And then we eventually launched it on the pond. Here is Augie, Max, and Matt and Hope dragging, the structure to be anchored in place. This one was anchored in 3 points with mushroom anchors. I think it has more, a little bit more anchors than it needs, but that's what the permit required. And here you can see it evolve over time. And again, the completion of a life cycle. Unlike our first structure, we had another growing season this past summer. The structure is still floating. I think I developed what I like to call natural buoyancy stress. So now, right now I'm stressed about how the structure is doing. But there are many lessons learned, and today I'll share just a few, but we are all happy to reply to more questions in the Q&A. We learned that context matters. As I shared, a rural pond and an urban pond behave very differently. Both structures were installed in mid-June, a timing largely determined by factors outside our control. I think the earlier the better, especially with our with the climate change surrounding us. But the first structure placed in a forested pond required no watering or maintenance throughout the summer. In contrast, the second, installed in a more exposed pond, struggled significantly. We had planted it just before a heat wave, and for at least 2 weeks, we returned regularly to water and monitor it. And at one point, we even considered relocating the structure. What was striking to us is that we hadn't even planned for maintenance because we didn't need it in the first time. So that became an important lesson in how deeply site conditions shape outcomes. When we returned in the spring to repair and replant, other lessons became clear. The knotweed pontoons had fully saturated. Natural buoyancy is seasonal, so replacement has to become part of the design. And that kind of maintenance, thinking of how you're going to maintain the natural materials over time. The mesh can be reused, but the system for swapping pontoons need to be more simpler and accessible. We also saw that soil-free planting truly worked. Roots had grown directly into the water and through the coir and knotweed matrix. Pre-incubating the planting beds in kiddie pools likely helped with early establishment. Though it's difficult to separate that from the broader stresses of an urban pond, we thought our first structure, the plants grew looked happier. But we also realized that connection systems matter. We have a lot of connection points when we, create the structures. So the stainless steel wire worked, but repeated disassembly revealed the need for a different system. And looking ahead, we're exploring ways to reduce or potentially eliminate our reliance on stainless steel mesh and mechanical connections altogether. We're especially interested in the role plant roots can play in forming the structure and in learning from the natural formation of floating islands and what we can implement in our design. And the photograph in the upper left corner, you can see the small plant plugs. We planted very smallly this year, and they were generously donated by Lizzie Hunt from the local plant nursery planting community. And looking ahead, we're looking at ways to reduce or potentially eliminate our reliance. Oh, sorry. It's repeating. So here you can see how the structure evolved over time from being planted very small. In terms of more than human life using the structure, we've had some meaningful encounters, witnessing a dragonfly that just emerged from its metamorphosis as we were repairing the structure. we found several dragonfly and damselfly nymphs that also underwent metamorphosis, and we discovered a monarch caterpillar on the floating wetland, which likely arrived when the monarch butterfly deposited an egg on the milkweed. On sunny days, you can find up to 30 turtles basking on the structure at once. It's quite a sight. And when we began noticing plants cut in clean straight lines, we suspected muskrat activity. So a wildlife camera later confirmed it. In terms of community engagement and education, the floating wetland became a living classroom too. Over 6 weeks, high school students explore pond ecology through drawing, observation, microscopes, and collaborative journaling. Their shared process culminated in a collective zine, The Exquisite Wetland, reflecting their relationship with the human and more than human world. And this meaningful project was led by Holly and Max with New Urban Arts and local teaching artists. And finally, we collaborated with the local artist Jasmine Gutbrod that I showed the illustration earlier, inviting people passing to learn more about the ecology, the nutrient cycling, nitrogen and phosphorus, and how life unfolds just below the surface. Ultimately, this project is about restoring ecological function by restoring our relationship with the living system that allowed water to regenerate itself. We're collaborating with native plants, sunlight, microorganisms, and the web of life, working with natural processes to bring water bodies back into balance. And I want to thank our supporters for the project through their grants and helping us with the permits. And thank you for listening. Feel free to reach out via email, stay updated on our Instagram, and check our website for more visual documentation and information on the project. And I hope you get the chance to see this beautiful charcoal animation hand-drawn by Holly on our website. Thank you.
Awesome. Really excellent presentations all around. It's wonderful to see all the different approaches to the same common problem and a really brilliant different lenses on the solution. So really grateful to each and every one of you guys for sharing. We have time for a couple of questions. I noticed a few coming in, but folks, if you want to get your questions answered, put them in the Q&A or drop them in the chat. One question that came up that if you guys are comfortable, I'd love to hear a little bit from each of you guys on your different projects on this topic. Where do you get the funding for these projects and how costly are they?
Yeah, I'll pop in. So we started with the first kind of round of funding that we got. The first thing we got was a Patagonia grant. That was the first big, like $10,000 grant. And then we used that and did a Kickstarter. And so the first section that we did was about 60 something thousand. And so that was 160 foot long. Seems like all prices have gone up tremendously since 2017, but that was how we started. But the Wild Mile as a whole, the first area that we built was about 1.4 million or so. And then the extension is kind of a similar number. So yeah, kind of leveled up slowly.
In the Wild Mile was involving public funding at that point, or what was the next step beyond the crowdsourcing?
Yeah. Oh yeah. So big chunk of it was a City of Chicago grant. So they had essentially a tax on tall buildings to build more open space. And so we fit into that realm because the area that you needed to spend the money in was the amount of money that they had versus, how much land costs didn't really work. And so we were kind of cheaper alternative. So, yeah.
Yeah. Our project had a lot of different pieces to it. I think the wetland itself was in the like $70,000 kind of range, but then there was also funding for the research, funding for the outreach program. So it was also kind of funded through private grant making, and I think there's a lot of different costs per square foot associated with these products. There's some that are a lot cheaper. as little as $15 per square foot. And then kind of the sturdier products are more like, 40 plus, inclusive of anchoring systems and planting. But then I think Nick and I especially had to do a lot, and Alexandra too, had to do a lot of engineering that, goes beyond, you can't just go ahead and put something in a public water body. So, there's consulting costs and engineering costs as well.
I had a selfish question I wanted to pop.
Well, can
Alexandra.
we get that from Alexandra's project as
please.
well? I'd be interested. The comparison.
So I'm also trying to see how other collective members can reply along with me, but I think for us, we kind of donated our time most of the time to do this project, especially for this first structure. But in terms of plants, I mean, in our case, we just had to purchase the stainless steel mesh. We actually repurposed most of the stainless steel mesh from the first structure into the second structure. And because it was a larger structure, we had to buy 1 or 2 extra rolls. And if I remember correctly, Matt might have had a roll too. The plants were about $1,000, I think, or less. And then for our second structure, it was a donation. So it was mostly our time. We put a lot of time in doing this work. So we got a and we paid the illustrator. So I would say and it's 6 of us. So I would say that it was about $10,000 project, but most of it wasn't the materials, it was our time. Yeah. So I would say just the materials, think maybe like under 2,000. And maybe 1,500, depending on the size, for the larger structure, the larger one. And maybe Hope and others have another answer, maybe put in the chat. Yeah, and we were supported by the Narragansett Estuary Program and the Rhode Island Wild Plant Society, and Storm Innovation Center also provided us funding. And we applied for grants.
Awesome. Thank you so much, each of you guys, for sharing that.
Yeah.
Appreciate that. And I'm sure everyone attending does as well. Raleigh, you had a question next?
Oh, yeah. Quick question. So, in Austria, there's this beautiful, especially in Vienna, there's these beautiful swimmable canals that kind of look similar to some of the projects you guys are building. Have you noticed any ability? Are these areas where there's floating wetlands, are these canals swimmable now, or what metrics does it have to hit before an area is declared, that it can actually be swam in by the public?
Well, this one is, I think, in my wheelhouse. I know too much about this. I'm going to give a short answer. In the US, we've got bacterial swimming standards for public beaches, and those are set at a state by state level. But for instance, in Massachusetts, a beach, in order to be a public beach, you have to have less than 126 most probable number of E. coli per 100 milliliters. So there's a bacterial threshold for any given day, and also kind of a rolling average over a certain period of time. And I'll speak for the Charles River, but I think this is true for a lot of urban rivers. What we are seeing in terms of bacterial contamination is that in the summertime, these rivers are starting to approach those thresholds. There's parts of these rivers that are safe with respect to bacterial contamination, meet swimming standards when it's not raining. But when it is raining, there's a lot of what we call wet weather pollution, which is, all that junk that's in stormwater, stuff that's sitting in the pipes, sewage that's finding its way into our pipe network. And, most urban rivers are not safe to swim after rainfall. And that's what you saw in Paris and the Olympics a couple years ago as well.
Great. Good to know. But what a joy it is to be in these places in the summer and just see everybody come out and be able to swim in the canals and the rivers near where they live. It's such a joy to see that and actually be a part of it. All right.
One question that we got asked a couple of times is, as far as if you guys have any favorite PDFs, online guides, anything related to the construction of these floating wetland features for someone who's really activated, they want to go out and start building some of these. What's the first place you guys would send them to? And on a related note, I just put into the chat everyone's various links so that you guys can follow up with these people, help support them on their journey. And yeah, follow up with the work that they're doing. But what are your guys' go-to resources as far as the technical construction guides for these floating wetlands?
I can share a little bit, and I see hope there as well. I mean, I've always start with keywords. So when we were doing our initial research, I looked at natural floating islands. I looked at and actually Jonathan Todd has, if you search for Jonathan Todd floating island or floating wetland, you'll see a 5-part video in which he is describing the process of building one with a community. And also, I think they were constructing some sort of solar powered aerator to be placed underneath the structure, which was very insightful as well. And reading about the natural formation processes is always very fascinating.
We also have
Nick and Max, do you have any guides you'd share for people or any other resources to track down?
Yeah, well, I mean, what I'd say, and this is different than what Alexandra's doing, but there are a lot of really smart people who have started companies now to kind of commercialize floating wetland products. And especially if you're in an urban context, if you're outside of the DIY context, all of the work that they've done gives regulators, gives your Wetlands Protection Conservation Commission a lot of confidence. These systems aren't going to fall apart and, float downriver and clog something. So I would, in my point of reference, working with the manufacturers who have a lot of expertise in designing these systems, they're an incredible resource.
And I'll also say, sorry, Nick, that for example, in our case, we can build out of natural materials because we don't have strong currents in the water and everything that comes associated with the river. Right. I would be curious, the context matters in which you're trying to build the floating wetland.
Yeah. I don't know of any. I know some people are working on putting together DIY guides and stuff like that. There's some stuff in Missouri. And then there's the, oh God, why am I blanking on the name? Ready Center in New York who put together some stuff about it. But I think that's also, an opportunity. I think there's a lot of, ways to do it, I would just go by just reading as much stuff as you can about all the stuff in there, all the work that people are doing, and then just making it up.
Nick, I have a question for you. In Providence, the rivers are tidal, similar to the Charles, but they're small, just 12 meters in diameter, across. But there's an incredible amount of storm flow during storm events because of, impermeability within the city and direct discharge during storm events into it. So the amount of scouring that can happen is phenomenal. And so I'm just wondering, from a standpoint of putting in a structure like that, how did you have to think about how the structure would adjust to extreme volumes of fluxes in volume and flow, and heavy flow versus really shallow existence and things like that. I mean, because one river fluctuates on a normal tidal scale by 6 feet within the canal walls.
Yeah. Yeah. So ours, we had to spec it for, we have about 9 foot of change that will happen at maximum when there's huge rain events and stuff like that. That happens not on like a tidal thing. It just more when there's a big rain event. So we had to make it so that we use these helical anchors, so basically screws that go in, chain, and then these elastics. And then those stretch as it moves and keeps it kind of in a fixed position as it goes up and down. We don't have a ton of things to worry about in terms of the flow, but they're spec to a pretty high thing. So they're beyond what we would really receive in our area. So I think it just comes down to working with good engineers on like how sturdy and how many anchors you need to use and everything like that. Like I think in our first section there was something like 40 different points that it's connected to. So it's not gonna ideally go anywhere even if there was have a massive storm surge. But in our Bubbly Creek we use just independent islands that aren't on a they don't have any walkway, but they're also in the middle. And that gets a pretty big surge when there are rain events because there's a pumping station that pumps all the sewage overflow and stuff. So that can get moving. And so in that case, we have 4 acres on each one. And if it does kind of move, the hope is that something will catch it and slow it down. But they're also spec'd, I think we use like 55-pound Danforth anchors. So they're big boys. But so just figure out, like, just guess over engineer it and you'll be okay.
Thanks. A lot of engineering.
Yeah.
Cool.
Some other questions. There were a lot of questions around plants, which plants to use. If you guys have any favorite plant lists, and then Alexandra, you shared that awesome list, which was much appreciated, I'm sure. But then also asking why it's important to let plants complete their full life cycle. Don't you want to remove the biomass in order to get the phosphorus and nitrogen out of the water body?
Absolutely. And that's something we haven't done. And for reasons, but maybe I think Hope might talk more about the planting list and that process. So.
Sure. Yeah, I can. I mean, we found certain species. I mean, what we were trying to do initially was to have a lot of diversity of structure and height, and to think about how we could build in different elevations within the floating wetlands. So we tried to create higher areas and lower areas so that we could also have that diversity of species. But ultimately, it sort of all came out a little bit equal. But some species were hardier than others, and they are species that you can find in multiple habitats, sort of wet meadows and edges of ponds and edges of slower flowing rivers. The cardinal flower was, for being such a sort of delicate looking species, is actually really well adapted to disturbance and did really well. Pickerelweed also did really well. Joe Pyeweed. I was curious when we went to your floating wetland, Max, that the hibiscus had really been the workhorse that became in that sort of saline, or not saline, but brackish environment.
Tinged with salt. Yeah, and I'm jealous of all that beautiful pickerel weed. We planted a bunch, but it just did not survive on the Charles.
Yeah. Too salty, maybe. Or maybe got overpowered by the hibiscus.
I actually think for us, one of the things was the wave action from the wake of boats. So I think some plants that don't have super strong roots did not like that at all.
Yeah. Huh. Interesting. Yeah. I mean, we thought we were going to get into harvesting and testing for phosphorus. And as you know, we had very little private funding available to us, and we did have a connection at a lab, but the person that was going to do that ended up having too much. He had offered to do it for free, and he ended up having too much other stuff that he was required to do for his job, and so wasn't able to do that for us. But it would ultimately be something we really were going to be interested in finding out and using controls along the shore versus the plants in the bed to see what the differences were in terms of uptake of nutrients.
Yeah, and I know about the question about removing the biomass above. Why let the plants undergo their full life cycle? I think that was a time where we did have to harvest and we didn't. And I do know that in the paper you both published, Nick and Max, you are speaking about that practice as a way to remove the nutrients and compost them. As a nutrient reduction practice. But in the context of the larger, we thought that yeah. I don't know how to say it more clearly, but
yeah, and they're also serving a purpose through the winter in terms of stems that insect larvae can, nest and overwinter in, and seeds and things like that. So yeah, and muskrat food.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, one point I just want to make is, that I love floating wetlands, but they're not magic. Like, they're not going to solve the problem of a degraded urban water body all by themselves. The amount of phosphorus that's removed through the plants is measurable, but it's also kind of negligible. We looked at, okay, what would it take to solve the Charles River's nutrient problem with floating wetlands? And you would basically have to cover the whole Charles River with floating wetlands, which, on the one hand, it's a little bit crazy. But on the other hand, if you think about the size of the wetlands that we removed from this system, it's kind of equivalent. That's what's missing. So I think the way to speak to, like, why aren't we removing harvesting the material? Leaving it is great for habitat. Removing it, theoretically could be part of the nutrient solution, but that's not really the stage that floating wetlands are at. In New England, in Florida, they're actually used very normally as part of stormwater treatment. And in Florida, they actually harvest the plant material like 3 times a year because, it's warm there. Plants grow all the time.
That's really great context. Thanks for sharing that, Max. I think that paints the picture really clearly. And I also didn't want it to go unnoticed. Nick shared a really great resource for plants for their Urban Rivers project. It seems like there's a lot in there as well. I just shared that link again. Is there anything you want to add to that, Nick, for context?
Yeah, it has a link that shows all the plant species. You can kind of click around and see info about some of them. And then there's also a camera trap page, which if you're bored, it's a great way to just go through and identify wildlife on the Wild Mile. So, but yeah, that just shows all the plants that we used in our floating gardens. I think there might be 2 plants that are weeds in that list, but that's we didn't plant those ones, but they're there for observation stuff.
Cool, Zach. Real quick, there's some questions on the YouTube live stream, and then they're kind of similar to the other ones. Basically, for Alexander, your projects with the hollow stalks, with the stalk bundles. Would they eventually keep themselves floating when enough biomass is built up, or do you have to keep replacing them?
We have to keep replacing them. Absolutely. Yeah. It actually, I got straight. I had way too many slides in my presentation for today, so I did remove this slide where I was showing what we found when, the structure after winter. It was like underwater, and like we brought it back to the surface, and there were some plants that, like the cardinal flower, and that were just thriving. They were just doing their thing, but we ideally, that's a question as a group that we had, is like, do we need to maintain buoyancy before winter, and then as soon as the warm weather comes in, we have to do it again? And you kind of have to plan to have enough natural materials to do that, and you also need to have a good system to replace the natural, given our system, because we envelop everything in this stainless steel mesh. So I think you can just unlike, because it's a natural material, you do need to maintain that constantly, and that's why we're interested in maybe moving in a different direction. But if you do you study a little bit how, for example, the Uros people or the Madan people live, they're actually living with their houses on top of the floating islands, and they're constantly adding layers on top of the structure as a way to maintain the buoyancy of the structure that they live upon, which I think it's very interesting. Yeah. But yeah. Yeah.
No, I was just going to say, I mean, it would be interesting to hear from the other more, the structures that you have, Max, and that you have, Nick, how that buoyancy is calculated for the surface area. For us, it's working, trying something, and then trying something else as a result of what happens. But in our second one, we created more buoyancy because the first one had sunk by December, or was sinking. And but then it was too buoyant, and we had to add those rocks to the surface and water, because the roots couldn't grow fast enough during the drought period that we planted in to get down to the water. But then by the time December came around again, the knotweed had reached neutral buoyancy. And so it was, it was an interesting process, but.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think we look at, we just kind of kept increasing our buoyancy and flattening it too. So like, instead of having like two large, pontoons or something, having a bunch of smaller ones, it makes it easier and more forgiving to have things closer to the water. And, the other factor is like for maintenance. So like, as people walk on these things all the time. And so you have to make it so that it both can hold all of the plants and then, and also people. So, that's it's hard to do with organic material though, too, because as, things start to get saturated, whatever your initial calculation with is out the window. And so, it's a tough situation, but, yeah.
And what have you guys found, Nick and Max, for long-term buoyancy looking at non-organic solutions? Is it just plastic dock floats that you're using? Or someone asked about barrels. I'm wondering if you could just paint the picture a little bit better as far as what buoyancy devices you guys are using.
Yeah, so the docks are all just dock floats, but the gardens themselves are, it's a company Biomatrix that does the floating gardens. And so they're basically HDPE plastic tubes. And they range in diameter, but I think 140, 200 millimeters, something like that. So, like this big or so. And so, those are just a bunch of those kind of in lines, with, small gaps in between. And they, none of ours so far have, degraded buoyancy as far as we could tell. Some of them we put in, though, did have good buoyancy to begin with. So the earliest version is the hardest to actually work on. And part of that is just the size of the floats. The other part is the orientation. If you have one big mass of these, it's much more buoyant than when you have small little outcrops and stuff like that. So figuring that out makes it also easier. Yeah.
Awesome. We are getting to the end of our time here. I want to give each of our presenters a little bit of a chance for closing thoughts as well. I think one final question before we do closing thoughts. Someone was asking what education/background is most useful to do this work on a professional level? Environmental engineering, environmental science, landscape architecture, etc. If I can really quick chime in, this is exactly why we've created the Water Stories core course, where we try and walk people through what was ultimately a 5 to 10 year journey for myself to do this work professionally over 6 months. So I think that's a really good alternative option. If you're wanting to start doing this work professionally, you're wanting to learn how to get clients, how to do estimates, all that kind of stuff is built into the course. But I'd also love to hear from each of you guys. What is your own education background before doing this work? And what would you recommend to others who want to do something similar?
Happy to start. I'm an environmental engineer by training, and there are so many different ways to get involved with this work. So you just need to ask yourself, what are you most excited about? All these projects have community engagement components. They have, botany components. They have science components. They have engineering components. They have navigating bureaucracy and fundraising components. But what I will say as an engineer is, I encourage people who have that interest to go as technical as they can in their education. And I think the field of engineering has really changed in the last 10, 20 years, where there's many, many more people who are doing full-time habitat restoration work, which is really exciting. Used to be you'd have to do a little bit of habitat restoration and a little bit of designing a parking lot. And that's not the case as much anymore.
Yeah. I think just, to echo your point, I think there's a lot of different angles to get in. I think just having a passion about it, finding what you like about a certain topic, or what you can do well. I do a lot of navigating bureaucracies, which I hate, but it is the only way that it works. So, I think there's a lot of different angles to get in. I went to school, for entrepreneurship was my degree, which translates almost nothing to, this type of thing. And the whole point is to make profits, and I'm in a not-for-profit, so kind of the antithesis of the degree, but just experimenting, doing a bunch of things, I think is the way. And, also I think surrounding yourself with really good people is key. It's none of this is a solo endeavor, and, just having, either co-founders, partners, or contacts, mentors that know things you don't know just makes things go much more smoothly instead of having to, learn every single aspect yourself. So, yeah.
For me, I got into this work through my graduate education in biomimicry, and my teacher, Dana, upon me talking, I was very obsessed with ponds and creating habitats at that time, and she just sent me to study the work of John Todd and sent me to look at the work of Floating Island International, and I wrote to Bruce with the question, and somehow I got a research internship there. And, that was an introduction to learning about water quality and nutrient impaired water bodies. And, even just his approach, it was very educational. And then, I just developed this obsession with creating habitats and creating the conditions for life to return in urban settings. And I think I to your point, Nick, I've just always been surrounded by people whom I can learn from, and also, I've just sent emails, and people have been very generous in educating me back. So that's how I got into this work. And then just even for the plants, just the honor to learn from Hope, Leeson, about her deep knowledge in botany and plants and ecology. It's been amazing.
That's really great feedback, really wise. And I think it just drives home that this stuff is learned from others in community, in practice. And so ultimately, you're never going to learn it on YouTube. You're never going to learn it in a classroom. You're going to learn it finding good mentors, doing projects, executing, delivering. All that tacit learning that happens around it is hugely important. And so I found that as a theme between each of you guys. We're getting towards the end of the session here. Really appreciate each of you guys' time and everyone joining. Do you guys want to share some final thoughts to leave people with? People who are excited about bringing this work to their own community?
I mean, for me, I think it's great. Just there's so much opportunity in this. There's so much need, So like, take a little aspect, try to build something as quickly and cheaply as possible. Put it in the water, see how it goes. Learn from there. There's plenty of the things aren't just going to be solved by like some higher up bureaucracy in most cases. Like, I think having a lot of this at a grassroots effort is really what pushes things forwards and makes this more of a common thing. So yeah.
For some reason, to me, my closing thought is embrace the bureaucracy. Doing things that impact the public is a big deal, and it takes a really, really long time, and it can be frustrating how slow the going is. But it's really worth it. And every conversation you have to have is a chance to educate, to learn more about other people's perspectives at different kind of parts of how the world works that maybe we weren't thinking about. So don't get frustrated. Stick at it. Be ambitious. There's a way to do it.
Fair enough.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. And also just finding a way just as small as possible to create the conditions in which you can gain this embodied knowledge and learn from the web of life. But also, as Zach says, go out when it rains. Very important. And Max, I know Max says this too, when it rains. So maybe bring more people outside when it rains and maybe start the group from there, just the collective around stormwater runoff and improving water quality. And also, be curious about the invisible life in water.